Hey, welcome back to the Fennel shed on this extremely cold February morning. I'm keeping the hat on. It is literally that cold, despite having every heater that we possess on. We're here today to do part 6, and I'm calling this a woven star. And this goes in the top, bottom, left and right in the middle position. So it's a really, really important part of the whole composition. So as you can see here, it's got essentially a friendship star with a smaller one inside. So I'm going to show you in detail, that keeps slipping. I'm going to show you in detail how the various elements are made and then put together to create this block. So the first piece that I'm going to show you is how to do these sets, and these are identical. So we do a set of 4, all exactly the same, pair block, so 16 in total of this element here, with the half square of the main visible pattern, the one that stands out, a quarter square of the less strident one, and a quarter square of the background that is to disappear. So first of all, I've always called these a K block because it's like a capital K. You know, you've got your long line and your half kicked line, so or whatever it is that you want to call them, but they're not terribly complicated to make. So we start by making this combination of these 2 quarter triangles to sit in that half of the block. And in order to do that, what you'll have in your pack excuse me, or in your cutting instructions, is that you cut 2 squares or pairs of squares. So you'll have 4 sets of pairs, so 4 squares of your background fabric and 4 squares of your fabric number 4, and you combine those right sides facing, and these are 5 1/4 inches square. If you're only doing 1 cut, do a little bit of maths here, we're ending up with a 4-inch square. If you're only doing 1 cut, a half square triangle, you add 7/8 of an inch. But if you're doing 2 cuts, as in cutting diagonally twice, you need to add more. So we begin with 5 1/4 in order to end up fitting into our 4-inch square. So that's the end of the maths. So you get your 2 squares, and if possible, the ones that you've got in your kit are cut together already. You ladies that are cutting, I cut my strips 5 1/4, one of the lighter one of the dark one, and sandwich them together, press them together, and then cut them into their pairs together. And that way you know all of your sides and corners will match up exactly one onto the other, rather than being just about there. Once you have them in pairs with the lighter one always on the top, then you mark your 2 diagonal lines as precisely as you can. Once those are marked, you can put in a couple of pins so that your fabrics don't move while you work on them. And then you want to sew a 1/4 inch seam with the light fabric on the top, a 1/4 inch seam. As you look at it, as you begin sewing from the outside corner in, you're going to sew a 1/4 of an inch away from that marked line on the left hand side as far as the middle. So that'll be 1, 2, 3, 4 times into the middle, and then you cut through as I have done here. That will give you 4 quarters. And the reason why you have to cut on the left hand side is because we want this star always to be spinning clockwise. And if we did half of them on the left and half of them on the right, then half of our stars would be spinning anti-clockwise and the other half would be spinning clockwise, and we don't want that to happen. So by keeping the lighter one on top and always sewing on the left, you will always have this arrangement where the light one is on the right hand side of the pair and the patterned contrast one is on the left hand side. And once you have those all made, you introduce them to their next door neighbour, which is the larger half square triangle of fabric number 7. And once those are pressed, you pair them. Before you pair them, you trim away any corners That tidies it. Press it properly and then set this one on. And you don't match this diagonal line because those diagonal lines can be a wee bit approximate. You match the outer lines and the outer corner so that they match. You see here, that's gone astray. So I match the outer lines. And you know that this half square triangle is exact. So that's the one you use as your guide when you sew across the diagonal. And once you have that stitched, you will have these guys. And you will have a set of 4 per block. So you will end up with 16 of these. And once they're done, stitched and pressed, the last thing that you have to do before they're incorporated in is once again the important trimming them square, trimming them straight. And again, we can use the 45-degree line on the ruler. This is the ruler that I've used before. It's a 4.5-inch wide ruler, and our square should be 4.5 inches wide. So by setting the diagonal onto the diagonal, I know it's safe to remove everything that is outside the edge of the ruler and then turn it the other way. Turn the ruler the other way because I have the diagonal going in the other direction at the opposite end of the ruler, and trim so that the diagonals are running into the corners. You don't want to trim all of it, the excess, off one side and not off the other, because you'll be clipping the corner and your diagonal won't run into the corner when you join it onto the piece next door. So that's how you trim. It's only little tiny slivers that come off, but they come off fairly evenly off all 4 sides, and then the result is a nice neat piece that fits into the composition as you see it there. So that's the first set of top, bottom, left and right for your blocks. Okay, once you've got top, bottom, left and right, we're going to move to the corners. Now, unusually in this block, there's 2 different types of corner. There's 2 of this type, which are the inner corners that work. If you can imagine, the middle of the quilt is in here and the outer border of the quilt is out there. So we've got 2 inner corners that differ from the 2 outer corners. So I'm going to start with these 2 inner corners because they are the simplest and they're a direct relation of the very, very first block that we did, the double 4 patch. This is a little 4 patch and then that's sat within a bigger 4 patch. So we start with this little corner one, and you remember the technique. We sew together a strip of the light and the dark fabric together. We did that twice. We marry them together. We press them together so that that seam just literally snuggles into itself. And then I mark. I've already got a couple of them made. And I'm going to mark these very clearly, so I'm just going to use an ordinary biro. Normally you'd use a friction pen or chalk or something that would disappear, but I want this to show up on the camera for you. So I'm going to use an ordinary biro because I'm going to cut through this line in any case, so it will disappear. And it's a blue biro going into a blue quilt, so that's the very worst that'll happen. So every 1.5 inches I mark. And then I sew on one side of that. And when I have stitched those lines and cut them away, and you can refer back to the instructions in part 1 if you need to refresh your memory on that. But that's what makes these little 4 patches, and you need to make 8 of those in total. And I'll just take this to the sewing machine now and sew one and come straight back to you. So we sew, remember, 1/4 inch away on one side only from the marked line, and then trim straight, and then using all 3 things, you can measure 1.5 inches on your ruler, you can measure 1.5 inches on your board, and you can be 1/4 of an inch inside your stitched line. So that's 3 different ways that you are confirming that you're cutting in the right place. 1.5 inches in from this edge in, confirmed on the ruler and confirmed again on the board. And that will give you a lovely, accurate 4-patch that should measure 2.5 inches square. But if it doesn't measure 2.5 inches square, again, even on something as tiny as this, it's worth taking the time to check it, and if need be, to trim it. And again, when trimming, we don't just willy-nilly take it off anywhere. It's a 2.5 inch square, so it should be 1 1/4 from the middle seam to the outer edge. So again, I'm using the ruler line here and measuring 1 1/4 inches out from the middle. Virtually nothing to take away there. And the more you take these step-by-step preparation techniques, the more accurate your piece will be. So that's the piece that goes in there. Side by side with it goes an ordinary square. And then for speed and for convenience, on the other side, I've stitched my row of background fabric and my row of fabric number 3 together already. And then I can cut those into slices. I need 8 of these slices in total. I'm just going to cut one here now. A 2.5 inch wide slice. So you can see how that composition builds. So we sew these 2 together, always remembering to bring this little diagonal line is a stepping stone leading you to this contrast number 3. You don't want it to be that way, otherwise you're going to have to unpick. So sew these 2 together, then onto that, and you'll have this. And that's your inner squares. You need to make 8 of those. So now, having done the 8 inner corners, we move now to do the 8 outer corners. And this is a completely different composition. You will have 8 of these 2.5 inch squares of fabric number 3. You'll have 8 pairs of these half square triangles of fabric number 1, the background, and then you'll have your large half square triangle of fabric number 5. And this, when you see the composition of the quilt, you will understand why I have added this into the design, because this completes the line. If you can imagine, your log cabin blocks are marching up diagonally up towards this, and then that completes the line and takes it out into the border where it turns and goes back down the other side. So how to make up this one? We sew these 2 together first with the 90-degree corners matching. You will always have your surplus piece of seam allowance coming out on the corner. So that one goes on like that. And once that is done and safely in place, you add this guy on, again matching your 2 90-degree corners like that, and add that out, and you will create a large half square triangle made up of those 3 elements. So, but what all you need to remember is that you don't worry about these sticky out tails. They need to be out there. That's your seam allowance. You match your square corners, and that will give you an element like this one here. 2 triangles and a square, which you set in place onto your larger triangle, just like we did for the middle blocks, lining up your outer corners. And when that's opened out and pressed, you end up with the element that you need to make your outer corners. One thing that you need to watch at every stage, when you add on this light fabric onto its contrast next door, you press it that way. So that one disappears in underneath there. And then the next one, once you add it on, it also disappears in that way. So you can see on the reverse here that the light fabric always tucks in underneath the slightly darker contrast. and that allows you to have a lovely clean edged contrast, clean edged sort of well-defined line between this square, which is an important part of the composition of the block, and the background fabric behind it. And then it sits into place and becomes the outer corners of your block. So now we've done all the elements for top, bottom, left, right, and all four corners. We move on to this very, very intricate centerpiece. Now, finally, we come to this very intricate centerpiece star, which again is a double friendship star, but this time it's on point, which complicates it all. Now, for the purposes of what I'm showing you today, I'm not going into the maths of the individual numbers. That'll be on your written instructions. The fabric pieces will be cut out for you that are getting the kit. But I really want to show you the essentials of how this is assembled, because it's, once you've broken it down, it becomes a 9-patch. But looking at it there, you go, where do I begin? So this is where you begin. Your centerpiece is what you see, and you start with these little corner squares. It's like any mathematical problem. You start with what you know. This corner square is what we know. And we bring it and its next door neighbor, this small half square triangle, together. Like that, and sew down one side from the 90-degree corner with the square on top and the triangle beneath, and always on that right hand side, so that you create that shape. Putting these two together, you get that shape 16 times. Once you've got that shape put together, you add on this extra one onto all 16 of these. So then you've got a 3-part, a square with a small triangle and a larger triangle added on. When that's done, it will look like this. You've still got all your sticky out corners. So we need to trim those. And this element should be 1 7/8 wide. So we don't want to take anything off this at all, other than the bits that are protruding from the edge. And to straighten up where we can. And we do that 16 times until we have 4 sets of 4. That element of the jigsaw sits in there. So you've got your corners, you've your first triangles on, you've your second triangles on, and then at this stage you sew 3 together, 3 together, and 3 together. And that's where I say it becomes essentially a 9-patch, but on point. And then the construction makes sense. So I'm going to take those to the sewing machine. To make it clearer now what stage I'm at, I'm showing you this but turned on point, so that you can see that this is the way that it's assembled. 3 elements plus 3 plus 3. And that's what I mean when I say it's like an elaborate 9-patch. 3 elements here, these 3 stitched together, and these 3 stitched together. And so I combine these in to become that one central unit. And finally, once you have all 9 elements made, as you can see, it just becomes a big 9-patch. You just want to make sure that you've got all of these in the right places. 2 of the outer corner, or sorry, the inner corners with this blue, deep blue that leads into the quilt. The outer corners with the half square triangles. And these guys, if they're in the right place, this one runs parallel to that. That one runs parallel over there. And you can see that dark feature rotating clockwise around the centerpiece. And then we sew them together, 3, 3, and 3, and then finally the rows together to create the block. And that's what I'm going to do now. So once you have it assembled into 3 rows of 3, need to backtrack very slightly. Trim everything, every single element should be 4.5 inches square. And when you trim Make sure not to trim too close to any of your star points. Once it's trimmed, you can sew them together in 3 rows of 3. When they're in their 3 rows of 3, these outer guys go in towards the middle and the middle one comes out. The middle one is framed in a light colour, and it also has an awful lot of very intricate seams, so it works better if it's allowed to relax and the others can fold in. And now I'm going to finally sew them together and put it in its place in the quilt. Now this is just the second, and you'll eventually have 4. I have the first one in place and the second one I'm placing in. And when it's in place like that, you can see how it takes its place within the composition. That these inner corners that I spoke of complete this line, that it brings right out to the edge, it turns with the star and goes back, and that these corners complete the log cabin. And then once you have those 4 in place, we move on next month to do these 4 corners.